Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Will Stephan. I'm one of the theme leaders for the CURF program here at the University of Canberra. First, I would like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, who are the traditional custodians of this land on which we are meeting, and pay respect to the elders of the Ngunnawal Nation, both past and present. I extend this respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island peoples in attendance this evening. We're very privileged this evening to have as our speaker Mr. Malcolm Snow. Malcolm is the CEO of the National Capital Authority. He took up this role following a senior executive career working with statutory and commercial organisations. He is one of Australia's leading placemakers and was the inaugural chairman of the Place Leaders Association. Acknowledged for the breadth of his experience as well as for his advocacy for creating better cities, Malcolm has led revitalisation programs in Australia and internationally. He is also an adjunct professor here at the University of Canberra. So I'm very pleased now to turn it over to Malcolm, who's going to talk about rebooting town centres.
Well, thank you very much, Will, for that introduction. I'd like to begin, in fact, by expressing my appreciation to the Centre for Urban and Regional Futures here at the University of Canberra for their kind invitation to speak at this ongoing lecture series about contemporary urban issues. I think I was asked, when you heard my background, because of, in fact, my experiences in different cities and in different urban contexts, particularly around that area of urban revitalisation, which I think is a really interesting topic and one which many cities around the world, but in Australia, are really looking at much more deeply as we realise we've really got to remake our cities in Australia. I think of myself probably as an urban designer, probably as an urbanist, I suppose, but something that I really feel very pleased to be able to still do in my current role as Chief Executive of the National Capital Authority. There's plenty of work for good urban design in the National Capital Authority. How our city and town centres look and work, and whether they meet community needs, is very important to our nation. Indeed, it has been argued, no less than Deputy Treasurers, that cities are the single most important determinant in maintaining Australia's quality of life, because, as many of us in this room would appreciate, it is our cities, and in particular their centres, that are producing the high percentage of our country's GDP and jobs. Notwithstanding this economic imperative, for too long, in my view, city planning in Australia concerned itself primarily with the physical environment and only secondarily with the people who use that environment. The overt physical bias of planners and the preoccupation of their co-creators, architects, with the object and a blindness to social context has resulted, I think, in some pretty poor place outcomes across our cities and suburbs. Fortunately, there's evidence that these priorities are shifting through a return to the core values of planning, which must be to help people solve their problems and realise their goals. My own admission of culpability is that as a young, starry-eyed planner working for the NCDC in the late 1970s, I helped prepare town centre master plans steadfastly guided by the principles of new town planning that had been applied with mixed results in post-war Britain. At that time, any serious thinking about the role of people in those town centres, about how you would create and nurture a sense of community, was simply too abstract and foreign a notion. The overarching strategy then, and still is, the Y plan, which in my view remains still a very sound idea. A quick history lesson. The Y plan promoted decentralisation of employment in order to minimise journeys to work, to protect the central national area from traffic pressures that might impact negatively on the dignified setting, and to promote better utilisation of the road network. Achieving this was contingent on public transport spines running centrally along the arms of the Y. Does that sound familiar? And freeways running along the edges of the town's clear of development. Following the Y Plan, the NCDC in the 1980s decided to review and examine these options for future urban settlement. The two key options that were left on the table for consideration were directing growth in employment opportunities and retail into the central area. This included Acton across Civic to Duntroon and included Parkes and Barton, and into the Woden and Belconnen town centres. This option didn't include Tuggeranong and didn't include Gungahlin town centres. The second option, establishing town centres for Gungahlin and Tuggeranong, each with significant levels of employment and retailing. This more polycentric option, with all the town centres included, was determined as having a number of very compelling benefits, and there were quite a few. But fundamentally, it was about the length and cost of journeys by residents of all the towns, but in particular those in Tuggeranong and Gungahlin, being reduced. There was significant savings on investment required for urban arterials and parkways. I could go on and describe those benefits, but they were compelling. The Australian government's own office location employment strategy around this time was complementary to the idea of decentralised town centres. It was intended to limit growth of Commonwealth offices in Civic and have priority to the development of additional office space in town centres, particularly Belconnen and Tuggeranong. The current National Capital Plan still to this day has policies which concern itself with office employment, and those policies are very much aimed at maintaining the option of further employment in the town centres, of avoiding traffic congestion in the central national area, of ensuring still the dominant role of Civic, the proper role of Civic, that's maintained through a very clear hierarchy. So it still, as I said, remains a very valid idea. Notwithstanding possible flaws in the prevailing planning logic about how the Y Plan might have been implemented, what other metropolitan planning strategies around Australia are grappling with and are seeking to do, in a way, in fact, is to emulate the really clever planning DNA in that early planning. And it's the Canberra model of aggregating land uses in jobs in dispersed centres. And those cities are now trying to, after the fact, retrofit their cities to reduce their dependency on and the dominance of their CBDs. So we are, I think, in a quite enviable position. Many cities trying to retrofit their places. Canberra has this inherent advantage. The unresolved tension, however, between the CBD and the centres is, I think, still and remains a critical area of debate for our city. Those days of the Commonwealth Government dictating where government buildings and jobs would be located, together with a combination of other misguided, perhaps, policy and market-related factors, have conspired, I think, to devalue the town centres and the original place aspiration that was developed for them. Australian cities, most recently Canberra, generally rank high in international surveys which measure how well they are performing against their global competitors. Livability is usually a criterion in many of these indices, and like other cities, in competition for the attraction of inward investment and social capital, so Australian cities and their urban condition have been elevated at last to a matter of national political interest and media debate. What these City League tables, if I could call them those, struggle to properly measure or value are the intangible aspects of city life that can't be quantified but are essential for people not just to survive but to thrive. Certainly economic opportunities and efficient markets have given us, most of us in this country, a very enviable quality of life. But when asked what they want from their cities and their town centres, for that matter, Australians frequently cite social interaction, a feeling of connectedness, public space, creativity and stimulation. All cities must meet the social as well as material needs of their residents. But city surveys generally do a very poor job of taking this into account. And at a time when Canberra's economy is yet again under renewed pressure, how well are our centres working as an essential element in the choices we make and the priorities we set in setting a path for recovery for our city? We have 3 tiers of government in Australia. Historically, responsibility for the planning of towns and centres has been devolved in the name of subsidiarity to local government, under the provisions, of course, of state-level legislation. However, in the face of strong economic and population growth and the resultant pressures on urban infrastructure provision, new governance models for managing the way the cities are planned and built have had to be found and applied. Municipal, and in the case of the ACT Territory Government, more usually oriented to delivering essential urban services, the roads, the rates, and the rubbish, if you will, are having to rise to the challenge of not only making new places, but more importantly, renewing existing places. And they're doing that by having to become much more adept at planning strategy, its formulation, and its conversion to innovative implementation responses. The results have been patchy and complicated in many cases by forced amalgamations and a lack of skilled staff. As a city-state government, the ACT has both a spatial and political advantage. That means it is much better placed, in fact, to tackle these issues than other capital cities, where the planning landscape is certainly more confused and certainly more contested. In all planning jurisdictions, a more discerning community and a more vocal development lobby, however, have made the task more complex than at any other time in urban Australia's history. They have also driven recognition that the factors now shaping what I would call the place-making process, particularly where there are spatial aggregations of uses and activities, really, in fact, is now demanding new partnerships and new delivery mechanisms. The key determinants, in my view, influencing a more informed approach to placemaking in Canberra's town centres can be summarised as being the need for 1, achieving higher densities, both in residential and commercial developments to reduce the cost of infrastructure provision that we've already paid for in many cases, and of course, adverse environmental impacts. Second, we need to facilitate a much richer mix of land uses, vertically as well as horizontally, through more design-responsive planning mechanisms that are less focused on rules and instead are focused on outcomes, particularly where those can be driven by performance standards. Thirdly, we certainly need to, in my view, reduce our city's ongoing high car dependency and the congestion that causes through a closer integration, that elusive integration of land use and transport planning, and by lifting public transport's extremely low mode share in this city by making it a much more attractive and highly attractive alternative. Fourthly, we need to secure greater investment in the public environment of the town centres in order to strengthen what I see as fairly weak core community values. We need to do that in order to stimulate inward investment by creating an environment that investors would want to invest in, and also, of course, to transform city image, to actually give it a meaning and a significance that people find memorable and want to return to. As an urban designer, I admit I always look to the old world to see their fascinating histories and fine-grained urban patterns, to understand and appropriate those aspects of public space, planning, design and use that we and many other of my professional colleagues, I think, still see as being relevant in finding clever solutions to the challenges that we as urban designers and planners face. In many Australian cities and town centres, existing public spaces are being replanned and rebuilt to accommodate not only higher population, but also in those spaces, higher usage levels, due to the greater demand for public recreation areas, but also to perform new roles, as they must do, as adaptable multi-purpose spaces. So flexibility in the planning and design of all centres, whether they're large or small, to future-proof, I should say, their ongoing purpose, in fact, as popular destinations, something many European centres do very well, is placing greater creative responsibility on the planning and design professions and on government. Increasingly more Australians, or at least those who can afford to, are rejecting the great Australian dream, perhaps not in this image, and really rejecting that dream, the great Australian dream of a suburban detached dwelling with a large backyard, instead for an apartment with a balcony. Lack of community services, long travel times, urban fringe growth limits are some of the factors driving this escalating socio-demographic shift. Despite its smaller size, there is clear evidence of this trend in Canberra as travel times start to lengthen and the demand for apartment living in the inner suburbs steadily increases. As a direct consequence, access to public spaces such as parks for active leisure and contact with nature, particularly for children in our city, are becoming more critical to the health, in fact, of our cities. But because our cities are so young, the process of place revitalisation has not been unduly constrained by heritage or conservation issues to the same extent that you would find perhaps in other older cities that have been going for centuries. The pace and shape of urban development, however, has not been immune from, in fact, the global challenges facing all cities. Today, all of our cities in Australia, not just Canberra, but all cities, have to be in the front line of tackling those big issues such as climate change, food security, and a population explosion. So how we respond as a country and as citizens, to these threats over the next decades will, I think, be absolutely decisive. Effective and responsive governance arrangements will be a key determinant of those, quite frankly, who succeed or fail. Over the last 2 decades, Australian metropolitan areas have had a striking ability to benefit from globalisation and to compete for what I'd call footloose investment and labour. The evidence of this can be seen in the cores of our capital cities, in this case, Melbourne, which have an impressive quality, vitality and diversity in many cases. This could be sustained in the future, but 2 related sets of problems, in my view, would need to be addressed. First, globalisation, I should say, brought not just growth to our cities, but also prolonged income inequalities. These are increasingly reflected in concentrations of lower income households, living in poor standard housing and without adequate social infrastructure close by. Secondly, high growth has brought benefits, but also associated environmental costs. We're already seeing in this city rising domestic energy, water and fuel costs, and this will continue. Good city planning and management will be about maximising choices in the new accessibility era if we are to avoid the haves and have-nots polarisation that we're seeing somewhat disturbingly in other cities around the world. So what placemaking DNA do these diverse locations share? And what common principles and approaches have they applied that has resulted in the creation of successful places in their respective cities? Place success measured from the triple bottom line perspective, so that's people, planet and profit, that has seen these urban centres have profoundly positive impacts on their cities and their citizens. Top of the list of the factors that shape the success of centres is an investment in the creation of high-quality public realm, which not only strengthens pre-existing place characteristics and connections, but also introduces elements that contribute new place values and meaning. This is Subiaco Central in Perth, a fantastic urban precinct, revitalisation precinct, which was a very tired and somewhat unsafe part of Perth and has gone through literally a major transformation as a centre within central Perth. A shared characteristic of these really successful precincts and centres is that from inception their planning placed priority on making the public environment the focus of attention. From this key decision, and with the supporting place principles clearly articulated, the other urban elements were then able to be selected on the basis of how well they supported the public realm vision. So often in our city planning, we do it the other way around. The buildings come first, the public spaces later. I think there's an object lesson, and many people are realising that Kingston Foreshore didn't do it the right way. And that's why we're determined as an agency to make sure that City to the Lake, when it happens, does the public space first. This has demanded both resilience and judgment by the agencies who are looking after these revitalisation efforts. When the hard commercial decisions had to be made and the principles were being challenged in a decision between profit and place, place won out. A city's public realm, or the third place, as American academic Ray Oldenburg labelled it, supports one of its fundamental roles as places of exchange. As places not only of exchange, but in particular social interaction, to return to my theme. While it may be obvious that one of the most important aspirations we want in our lives is to have a social life, certainly in Australia we don't think critically, I don't think, about the role of cities and their public spaces play in this regard. Australia, earlier, in fact, I should say, is an urban nation, but perhaps more accurately, it is a nation of suburbs. Our land-wasteful, car-dependent urban sprawl has meant that for many Australians, their experience and use of public space is primarily related to the places close to where they live, such as local parks and town centres. With the push for higher densities and apartment style living, particularly in the centres where the jobs and amenities are, or should be, we're seeing the ingrained patterns of public space usage changing. With no new green spaces being created, urban planners are at last acknowledging the importance of streets as a town centre's most important public space, and more attention and funding is now being directed to making the user experience a much more positive one. Particularly, I think, from the pedestrian's perspective. Canberra's town centres, it could be argued, do have plenty of public open space, and they are well placed to support those population increases. But any walk around those spaces, any critical examination of the way those spaces work at the moment, I think leaves a lot to be desired. The public spaces we most value, both in our community and around the world, have what I'd call a wealth, a community wealth, and it attracts preservation and expansion. To create wealth and prosper, societies everywhere seek to build capital, a production factor not often desired for itself, but for its help in producing other goods. Today, there are many forms of capital: human, social, cultural, natural, and infrastructural. But it may be that a key to producing lasting wealth and a way to efficiently build and leverage these other kinds of capital is to focus on place. Place capital can be defined as the shared wealth, built and natural, of the public realm. And it is increasingly, in my view, becoming society's most important means of generating sustainable economic growth for communities, and certainly the places that support those communities in the form of centres. Where place capital is strongest, people actually compete to contribute to this shared wealth, often changing their behaviour in ways that ultimately support the value the place gives to others. Second on my list of key success factors for rebooting town centres would be a commitment not just to designing and building high-quality environments, but also to ensuring the places within those centres work well, recognising that aesthetics alone does not guarantee that people will be motivated to use centres repeatedly, or that they will adapt them in how they best meet their needs, irrespective of whether they are a tourist, a trader, a resident, a worker, a customer, or a citizen. Place management done well, in reality, is an amalgam of many things which in concert combine to sustain and enrich place experience. I liken it to a jigsaw puzzle. All the pieces must be in play and correctly fitted for the complete picture to be realised. Clean, safe, flexible, popular places are more likely to be the norm in our town centres, where priority is given not just to how they look, but how they function, and about how they're attuned to the user's experience in or of the place. There's a really fine line here, because in its most extreme form, you don't want to create an internalised theme park, where the user is manipulated purely for commercial benefit, and where authenticity is replaced by contrivance. But again, if I look at the current town centres in Canberra, we do have something very close to what I would call that internalised experience. And beyond that, not a lot else apart from markets and other aspects which are at least contributing to the public life of the public spaces in those centres. City governments globally are realising that the past ad hoc approach to coordinating the myriad of decisions and actions which impact on place image and visitor experience is no longer sustainable, and if not addressed, can jeopardise, in fact, the very economic prosperity that they are seeking to generate. More, in fact, are now restructuring their organisations to elevate the role of place and place management through inter-team collaboration, creative flair, operational flexibility, collaborative partnerships, and the relaxation of restrictive bylaws are the common features of this more enlightened approach. How well the ACT government is tackling this challenge may well elicit divergent views, but it seems to me to be one of the fundamental shifts in thinking and practice if Canberra is to realise the full benefits of its push to create a more vibrant city, full of interesting places, full of interesting centres, all offering great opportunities for their citizens. Moving on to the question of how well aligned current processes and practices of government, in fact, to the creation of successful centres. Can an overly bureaucratic and fragmented approach to making and managing places, such as centres, actually be a barrier to those places reaching their potential and building meaningful community participation? I would argue it can be. Increasingly, more urban administrations, particularly in the local government sphere, are asking or being asked by their constituents, what if we were to rethink their approach to the way they make and realise place-based outcomes that are aligned to both the corporate as well as the community outcomes being sought? So what they're doing is they're making place a central organising idea in the way in which they structure their approach to how they plan, to how they design and how they fund, to how they program, to how they maintain their assets. And city governments, as I said, are coming to the realisation that they can be much more efficient if they do so in delivering value and in creating that elusive place capital that I referred to. Just think for a moment, ACT government, what if instead of departmental silos of interest for the different components of making, managing and maintaining centres, there was a whole of organisation view of how we thought about place and how they aligned their work practices for that outcome. Place then not only as a central organising idea, but also as a way of first empowering and then enabling the capacity of a community, whether they are residents, traders, shoppers, property owners or tenants, to also accept responsibility for sharing in the strategies for making their centres prosper. This leads me to the third factor for centre success, and that would be organisational capacity and focus. In other words, the task of aligning that business, and I use the word business deliberately, of placemaking and the management of those centres to ensure it is results-oriented and that there is a total commitment within the organisation to the realisation of that end vision. The agencies and local authorities around Australia that are responsible for really successful centres have structured their skilled recruitment, their decision-making, their operations to ensure everyone in the agency is involved in the business of placemaking, because they're all working towards, with their communities, a common and shared set of goals. This cultural orientation and possessing the requisite organisational software, if you will, is of course a common attribute for all successful businesses. What the new development corporations that you see rising up and being formed in Australia have is that they've been created to create and revitalise centres, is that they have this freedom to think and act more commercially, more like the private sector, but with full public sector and community accountability. In short, they have the commitment to creating community wealth and not only private wealth. Southbank Corporation, where I was the CEO for a number of years, was such an agency, answerable to the Premier of the state, but governed by a commercial board with a quest to create a world-class place. Too often Australian cities, with their overly complex and politicised local government structures, have regarded the placemaking effort as non-core business, something that through ad hoc organisational arrangements might be realised more by good luck than in fact by good management. Revitalising strategic parts of Australian cities, such as their centres, is now in other states seen as sufficiently urgent to shift responsibility, in fact, away from municipal government to dedicated development agencies, whose statutory remit is to accelerate the redevelopment of key precincts, unhindered by factional interests, competing budget priorities, and short-term compromises that afflict many city administrations. This point leads me to the fourth factor, which is active participation and the recognition that successful places are created and managed through effective community partnerships, and by understanding that many hearts, heads and hands must be involved. The late American author and urban activist Jane Jacobs has long been a source of professional inspiration to me. She wrote with great insight about the importance of people exercising their democratic rights as citizens of cities. An engaged citizenry, Jacobs argued, is critical to the life of a city at all levels. At the level of the organisation, at the level of the building, the block, and also, I'd add, the town centre. One of the problems bedeviling many cities today is that regrettably many citizens, assume their power of influence in city planning and other public processes is limited to the oppositional, their right of refusal. This misapprehension is a roadblock, I think, to realising the full potential of cities, the places within them, and the ultimate empowerment of their communities. The concept of shared urban leadership, an acceptance that government alone cannot tackle the complex challenges, offers, I think, an alternative paradigm that many cities, big and small, are now adopting. What would it take to adopt this paradigm in our city? More positive models encourage citizens to actively shape their own city futures through genuine and spirited participation. Such models require enlightened public agencies and administrators to be committed to this alternative way of working. Of course, there are good examples. The one again I refer to is Southbank in Brisbane, where we formed a community group called Brisbane Southbank, which ultimately grew to over 200 members, and where small and large businesses, members of the community, came together, collaborating to make the precinct work better. A great model, and one which is still operating today. One of the core responsibilities of city planning is the facilitation of opportunities for the open exchange of views between people and communities. All too often, what I'd call the twin enemies of democracy, complacency and consensus, come into play. For when everything is decided, when dissent is silenced and alternative place solutions are not sought, then genuine citizenship ceases. A truly successful city, in my mind, is one which teems with engaged citizens who are encouraged to exercise their freedom and their capacity to imagine and present fresh possibilities through planning, through community structures and social reform, and through the ability to adapt and transform places over time. The final factor is the creation of value in the centres. If the definition of place is challenging, the concept of value is more so. Economists and political scientists have argued about this for centuries. The conceptual threads are endless. Intrinsic worth, in-use value, value in exchange, survival value, the list goes on. My contribution to the debate would be to say that even in practical terms, value should not be defined narrowly. The development profit equation is critical, with its attendant concerns about capital appreciation, income growth, and so on. But no less important in the consideration of value are such things as the legacy of new or refurbished community facilities, or the savings on infrastructure generally through more efficient use of the land and the use of the investment at hand, or tangible benefits like increased pride of place and a sense of emotional attachment to the positive experiences those places provide. What then are the ingredients that make a town centre valued within the placemaking context? Some observations I would make beyond the obvious issues of amenity and functionality would be, firstly, the importance of creating a heart, and for that matter, a soul, to the centre. A tangible, symbolic place that provides focus and differentiation from other places. A place that easily supports a mix of uses that includes employment, education, and economic activity as well as retail, and provides a people for one to come at different times and to use it different ways. Secondly, the need for a very high level, I think, of accessibility and connectivity, both between the centre and within the centre and to other places. The management of car movements and parking is possibly the most challenging and critical element to address in this aspect. Thirdly, a strong sense of that sometimes slippery concept of authenticity and recognition of the primacy of people, their relationships and experiences, the accommodation of their needs and interactions, of the historical roots of a centre and the elements of identity that need to be interpreted and expressed. This also means guarding against what I rail against, design mediocrity and formulaic responses in a world of brands and franchises. I hope I've been able to give you an appreciation of the direction I think needs to be taken to respond to the challenge of making and managing town centres that are beautiful, resilient, inclusive and contribute to what all cities must strive for, inspiring urban environments that nurture strong communities and help us achieve our potential. I'm optimistic about the future of Australian cities and Canberra because I'm seeing wider recognition that government is not solely responsible for the task. Daily media interest in the state of our cities, a more strident development sector, lobbying on a wide front of urban issues, new urban research bodies, including the one where we're here tonight, and the rise of community advocacy groups taking on social and environmental causes are, to me, clear evidence of a genuine concern for the way our cities and the places within them should look and work. Global environmental and population issues are at last being factored into the equation because local solutions must be informed by the challenges confronting all cities. Denial could be terminal. Joined up thinking and action, recognising that making and managing successful centres done in isolation of the other players and in ignorance of other possibilities is gradually becoming the norm. Place success breeds success. And so it is in the centre, it is the centre users, the shoppers, the traders, having experienced firsthand how well other places that define them can work when the requisite care and interest is taken, who are now demanding more. And we need to demand more, I think, of our centres in Canberra. It's this place-people nexus in action. And as a result, politicians, always attuned to any shift in voter priorities, are finally, I think, recognising the need to redirect resources accordingly. Thank you for listening, and I would be pleased to answer your questions.
Would be really valuable in, if we had that kind of approach that you just outlined in working with the ACT government, especially the Land Development Agency, about proposals like the Canberra Brickworks and Environs, because you get it, that it's about placemaking and about the public realm. Unfortunately, the Land Development Agency doesn't get it, and they seem to, as we saw with Kingston Foreshore, come out with things that are agglomerations of buildings without placemaking. And, we fear that we may be victims of a similar sort of scenario. And I guess you mentioned a few things like capacity building, and I've been thinking to myself, well, what is it that needs to be done? And I guess in a couple of ways, I think, if you look at the Planning and Development Act, it says that the members of the board of the Land Development Agency should include people who represent interests to do with landscape planning and also sustainability. But if you look at the membership of the board at the moment, they're mainly commercial interests, and I don't see any representation at the moment on the board on sustainability or landscape planning. And I don't know whether those sorts of capabilities are involved in the design review panel or not of the Land Development Agency. The other thing is the type of cooperation with the community. We have these project reference groups that meet like once in a blue moon, and each individual can have maybe a few minutes to say a view. We need to move towards more interactive models of working on projects, such as the one that you mentioned for South Bank in Queensland. So I guess really what you're describing is what we'd like, and we'd certainly like to see that kind of approach being developed more by the ACT government, including its development agency. So I don't know if you have any comment on how we can get to where we are now, to the sort of scenario you're painting.
Well, on a project such as the Brickworks, we're in our respective corners and we're duking it out. It seems to me, and you're leading with your group that charge. In a way, it's a shame it's come to this, and so one of my contentions, you're right, is that it's not beyond the wit of an agency interested in place outcomes to actually apply techniques. One of the most effective that I've applied in my career out of the UK is inquiry by design. So you actually sit down with the community at the very beginning, with a plan of the site, the area, the district, the neighbourhood, whatever. And the planners stand back and don't say a thing. And what they ask their community is, you tell us, you draw for us what your vision for how this place could emerge. Because what we want to tap into as planners is your understanding of this place, what its meanings, its values, its significance is to you as a community. The process then moves on to what I'd call a reality check, which is that, this project has to stack up financially. But the planners, the boards, and those who are responsible for these projects have heard something. They've taken the trouble, I should say, to listen and to hear something that no consultant could ever have provided to them, that those insights could never have been revealed unless they had taken the time to go through that process. So I would argue that really good place outcomes, where in fact you have the community on the sidelines cheering, saying, can we have more of that, is because we realised, and the agencies have realised, that in fact, if success is measured in multiple ways, not just through dollar value or return to Treasury, that in fact, in the long run, that's a better outcome for the future. So it does go to that organisational capacity thing that I talked about, a reorientation of the way you do the business of placemaking.
I'd like to ask, hello, Anne Thompson, I'm a Canberra citizen of some 40 years. I'd like to ask, what's the place of the mall in your vision? Because there's nothing that's less authentic, less local, less democratic, really, than a mall. And, you know, it's extraordinary to me that each of our town centres has been handed over to a mall, and most recently, Civic has been basically destroyed by the addition of the massive expansion of the Canberra Centre. So, and you can be inside any one of those places and you could be literally anywhere in the world. So...
Yep. I have to find myself agreeing with you, and I think, you know, when I talked about theme parks, you know, the extreme example of that in America has got to a point where if you have the wrong colour skin or you're not dressed appropriately, you are told to leave. Heaven forbid we get to that point with our malls. But there is a strong move towards demalling, you know, and that's a term, because people, back to that question, that slippery concept of authenticity, are looking for places that provide that sense of connection, that sense of belonging. I don't have any sense of connection or belonging when I go to those malls. In fact, my wife knows that I hate those places because I find them, you know, quite foreign in a sense. Many enlightened shopping centre developers, in fact, are turning back not quite to the high street model, but are certainly looking to externalise, not to create these introverted, commodified spaces, but in fact to return to the kind of place values that people are in the form of their shoppers, their clients and customers, that actually provide genuine engagement with the public realm. So, look, I think the legacy we have in our 10 centres is that we have these large, dominant malls. But I think, again, any clear strategy driven by an understanding of the primacy of public realm would look to the opportunities we have in many of those centres, given the amount of vacant land we have, to actually offer alternatives. I mean, my local shopping centre is Belconnen, and the one place I like going to the most is the market, because it's the market that offers me the opportunities to see, interact with people that I, you know, like to choose my meat from and my vegetables and all those sorts of things. Now, that's not necessarily for everyone. There is a place for both, but we need to rethink our centres such that we can broaden out, I guess, the options people have, rather than just simply allowing, you know, further and further extensions of the same old, and then around those centres, no visible forms of life, or not a lot of it, I should say.
Okay, my name's Richard Lucas. I'm originally a Sydney sider, so don't hold that against me. I first came to Canberra as a young little fella in 1955. So I've seen this place grow over a period of time with only the Sydney and Melbourne buildings in 1955 when I was 6. So I can work out how old I am now. And anyway, what I was quite concerned about, I think the key, Malcolm, you've got, is education. I think that's so important to get the community on side, because so many politicians only think of the next election and what they can get out and how many votes they can get, rather than trying to get the community involved in a win-win situation that everyone can win. And the other problem that I can see is that there's these malls and what have you that I believe they're the cathedrals of on Sundays now, because everyone goes to the mall, and it does lose a lot of individuality. And I'm glad to hear that you like the Belconnen markets for your own shopping, and it's very positive that we need to have a community involvement. It's not just the sort of like some of the bureaucrats think that the radicals get involved, so they got the numbers and they're going to bulldoze their way through and not taking notice of anyone else. But I think the whole approach should be community education and try and get people involved as you can. And I also noticed another point that I know from Strathfield, Burwood, inner city, in the west. And there's problems with that area in the sense that you've got two municipalities, Strathfield municipality and Burwood municipality. I know the Beard government is trying to cut all that out, but whether that's what the community wants is another thing, because I'm in Canberra. But the point... Yep, the question is, how can we get the whole of people involved more often? They're not just think of profit and not just think of people.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, one part of me says that we actually need to tell people we've got a crisis. That would be a bit alarmist. But the best example I can use is my experience in Melbourne where, in fact, those regional shopping malls like Chadstone had turned the centre of Melbourne into a 9-to-5 city, Monday to Friday. There was no one in the city on weekends. Councillors were elected on the basis of the position they wanted to take in relation to how they would revitalise the city centre of Melbourne. It became a political issue. What is your policy position in relation to restoring and revitalising the city centre of Melbourne? And it wasn't just the citizenry, it was business as well, because business, David Jones, Mars, the banks, were all saying, we don't like this city. What are you going to do about it? And so it became a political issue that was then unavoidable in terms of it being something left to the next political cycle. It was a case of saying, unless you're able to articulate a clear vision, a long-term vision about how we turn this situation around and re-energise, revitalise the city of Melbourne, we won't vote for you. Articulate it. And because there was such broad-based support for the urgent need, not quite a crisis, it was approaching it, because the city centre was literally dead, that change was effected. So I suppose my response is, how do you educate people? Well, I think fundamentally it's the citizenry that needs to rise up and say that we don't accept that condition. And we need to articulate, if you're running for public office, what your position will be around the kind of changes, the kind of policies, the kind of strategies, the kind of actions that would be needed in a joined up, integrated way to actually tackle that problem. So often we, I think, fall into the same trap of what I'd call short-termism by just simply accepting the electoral cycle as being the given, when in fact in this country and in our cities I think we need to actually force a discussion about something that's much more long-term, and that we hold those in public office accountable for their progress in achieving that outcome.
Damien Haas, mostly to Light Rail. You talked about people, places and making better use of, our suburbs and our city. The current Light Rail project runs from Civic, or was proposed to run from Gungahlin to Civic, and Gungalin's the only town centre that doesn't have a big mall dominating it. And some of the other town centres have unfriendly transport which spits people out and then they're sort of lost. How do you see Light Rail contributing to making Canberra more livable in using those spaces better? And do you think that the hub and spoke from, say, the CBD to town centres is a good way to go, or would you like to see it extend further out and linking people right throughout the city, not just in town centres?
Well, look, I go back to the Y plan, which I said in my talk is still fundamentally a very sound idea. And the Y plan did, in fact, identify along each of those spines mass transit. So you could argue that Light Rail and Capital Metro, in fact, is about realising the northern arm of that. Look, an investment in mass transit, an investment in public transport, I think, is a really important thing for any city to do. This car dependency that we have in this city and bedevils many cities, we have an opportunity to do something different. Whether it's hub and spoke, whether it's spider web, I mean, the reality is that trams and light rail can only go on certain routes. I think the solution really relates to, in fact, a concerted public transport strategy. I would have loved to have heard a debate in this city about the role of buses and how, if light rail was to be introduced, how that would free up the bus system, because ultimately buses are trams with rubber tyres. They just happen to be run on the road. But how could we actually have a strategy in the city that sees different types of public transport modes being thought of and planned in an integrated way? Look, I think the light rail will add major significant value along its corridor. I'm disappointed, however, that the discussion around urban consolidation along those corridors hasn't been as vocal as I think it needed to be, because unless we link mass transit, public transport to what happens along that corridor and the ability to potentially reduce that car dependency given the proximity of public transport, we've missed the point.
Ewan Brown from Gungahlin Community Council. Thank you for your insightful comments about particularly the sense of space. Gungahlin in particular was developed as a quiet urban village, but there seems to be a temporal factor and a critical mass issue that really needs to be addressed, because we have grown at such a rapid pace that it's no longer a little quiet urban village, and yet it's been built with one street facade. There is really not enough room to expand. And if we do get the light rail, that's going to take over half our major public space in the centre of the town. So what's a Gungahlin solution?
Right. Look, I think Gungahlin is, I wouldn't call it a success story, but I think, it seems to demonstrate that we've learned some of the perhaps lessons from the other town centres. I think it's got strong prospects. What I would have liked to have seen is a bit more density, a bit more intensity, because again, the attitude, as we often have in Australian cities, is land is this limitless resource, we can just spread out as far as we like. When in fact, if we think about the old world cities we really like, when we visit them as tourists, what we like is this scale, and it's still very attractive, but at the same time, there's an intensity and also a diversity there. So what I'd like to see in Gungahlin is possibly more intensity and more diversity. I'm worried that it just becomes that dormitory centre when it in fact could be much, much more. Why can't there be more jobs in Gungahlin? Why do we need to have a light rail that takes people to the jobs when in fact every other large metropolis in the world is desperately trying to work out how they bring the people to the jobs, not the other way around?
Right, I'll try and be quick. Marianne Aubrey-Collis from the Reed Residents Association and also the North Canberra Community Council. I love the idea of the placemaking, but I think we've got a much broader remit than that, because we're talking about Gungahlin, I could talk about Reed, I could talk about the Doma drama in Dixon, but I think we're making a place for the rest of Australia. It's a national placemaking event that we should be thinking about, and I think that you've mentioned how important it is to integrate things, but how do you go about taking Canberra from 2015 to confirm or restore its place in the hearts of Australians? And I know we've got a battle, because every bad decision is always blamed on Canberra, but on the other hand, I think we've got to win the hearts and minds of not just Canberra residents, but the rest of Australia.
Well, yes, that is the challenge, and it has to be, as I said, through strong collaboration. The NCA can look after its bit, if you like, but, we'll have a part of Canberra that looks fantastic and the rest can be the rest. I don't accept that, and it's why the NCA works very closely with the ACT government to actually have that common view of what's in Canberra's long-term interest, and I think that's essential. The NCA will provide advice, encouragement, counsel as required, but at the same time, I think it's important that I agree with you that it shouldn't just be one part of the city that looks terrific and works well or is something that all Australians are proud of. I agree with you. I reject the Canberra bashing, noun in the Macquarie Dictionary. I don't accept that. We, as a city, have so much opportunity as a place that can do things differently. Once upon a time, when I was in the NCDC, we were interested in the idea of urban experimentation. We'd give it a go. We'd do zero-lot subdivision. We'd do group title subdivision. We'd design town centres. We'd do things that other cities wanted to copy. How could we get back that quality of being the city that other cities want to emulate? So I think that's the answer to your question. How do we regain our mojo as a city prepared to take some creative risks and have a go? Because right now, just when it's tough, again, the same old cycle, we need to break out of that cycle by being prepared to take some creative risks about the way we plan our city.